Hi, my name is Michael, and I made a game called Annabot for the Toxic Terror Game Jam, hosted by Phisnom. The game won second place. This is the developer commentary for said game. For those who haven't seen it, because I didn't really announce it anywhere, Annabot is a 2D sit-and-survive game with some survival horror elements. If you'd like to play it yourself, it's free, and there'll be a link in the description for you to download it. It can be beaten in about half an hour, but your results may vary. I'm obviously going to be spoiling the events of the game in this video, so go play it if you'd like to experience it blind. Despite its short runtime, it does have a bit of a story and a few surprises in store, so if that appeals to you, go give it a whirl before continuing. Alright, welcome back. The game was developed in a little under a month, since that was the duration of the jam, but I'm also going to be covering anything relevant to the game's creation leading up to that 1 month development period. Bear in mind that a few of the things I'm going to bring up won't initially sound relevant to what the final game ended up being, and I might go on a few tangents. I promise they're all ultimately relevant to the game's creation to varying degrees. Sorry, this is just how my creative process works sometimes. That being said, I'll do my best to keep things cohesive. As a heads up, you'll hear me justify the inclusion of a lot of things in the game with I like. I apologize in advance if it gets a bit repetitive, but I think projects like this are at their best when they're just an amalgamation of things the creator enjoys. I like robots, I like guns, so I made a game with robots and guns. I just hope I haven't made a game that only appeals to me. The story of Annabot's creation starts with the SCP Wiki. For those unfamiliar, the SCP Foundation is a fictional organization dedicated to the containment and research of anomalous objects and phenomena. It's the basis for games like SCP Containment Breach and SCP Secret Laboratory. In the fall of 2025, I was rereading a bunch of classic SCP articles when I came across an article I hadn't thought about in a long time, and that's SCP-191. SCP-191 is a young girl that was forcibly augmented with a variety of cybernetic implants by some now-dead scientist. She's in poor health, struggles to move, and can't speak. The article is written with 191 being fairly new to containment, and the Foundation is unsure about what they can do for her quality of life, and what will happen to her as she gets older. Her situation is ultimately very bleak. Now, you're welcome to call me a pussy here, but the first time I read SCP-191, many years ago, I got pretty sad. And even though it had been a while since I had given 191 any thought, rereading the article made those feelings return. And I know that's probably the intended reaction to the article, and I'm a sucker for falling for it and all that, but after finishing my rereading and thinking it over a bit, I asked myself a question. Has anyone else done something with this character? Now, this wasn't the first time I'd asked myself this. The SCP Wiki has a type of page called Tales, essentially more standard stories grounded in the SCP universe, often based around one or more existing articles. Back when I first read 191, I had the same thought, and read the tale Special Assets, which was written by one of the original authors of 191's article, Dr. Clef. And it was alright, but very short, and not quite what I was after a story about 191. But there had to be more, right? I read that tale years ago. Surely more had been written about 191 since then. But to my disappointment, there was very little. Most of the tales listed under SCP-191 didn't really have her as a focus, and that was assuming her presence in these tales went beyond a brief mention. And the tales that did include her in a more substantial capacity didn't really have what I was after. I wanted something that really focused on 191 as a character. I wanted to know what made her tick. The Foundation doesn't really know what she thinks about anything, really. In their eyes, she just kind of exists without complaint. What I wanted was for someone to really dig into the inner workings of her mind. What kind of person was buried underneath all that metal? So, my search continued. I scoured the wiki for every mention of her, and though I found several unique pages, there was nothing to scratch the itch that I had. Eventually I went off-site, and that didn't help either. Do you have any clue how desperate you need to be looking up SCPs on AO3? Sadly, my search off the wiki produced even less results. To be clear, this search spanned several days. I have a tendency to get suddenly attached to obscure characters, and inevitably get disappointed when there isn't a lot of content out there that focuses on them. I desperately wanted something to satisfy my urge to see more of 191, but the existing stories and what fanart she had just weren't enough. After a lot of wasted hours, I just had to come to terms with the fact that SCP-191 was a character that, ultimately, not many people cared about. She didn't have the staying power of the classic SCP murder monsters, and she didn't have the intrigue of more modern, longer-winded SCP articles. She was just one SCP article among a sea of thousands, mostly forgotten to time. With nowhere else to turn, I wondered if I could make something with SCP-191 myself. My initial idea was to write a tale of my own, but that attempt petered out because writing is hard. But I did have a more ambitious idea. There's this classic post about the BioShock games that captures their ability to make you care about characters in a sort of daughter role when they get put in danger. I couldn't help but wonder what that might be like with SCP-191 in that position. I was imagining a game that takes place during a containment breach, where you're some prisoner or researcher who has to escape, while also keeping 191 from falling victim to any of the other anomalies that are broken out. I liked how it was a subversion of the creepy little girl horror trope, where the girl in question was something to protect instead of something to fear. It was an ambitious idea, and one that I'd probably never be able to fully realize, but it appealed to me specifically, so I kept it in the back of my mind. As October started to draw near, I was talking with Kako, a friend of mine. If you're a fan of Phisnom, that name probably sounds familiar. He's been a co-host on a lot of streams. Anyways, he told me that Phil was planning to host a game jam for October and that I should enter it. Now, I hadn't entered a game jam before and was busy with my own project at the time, so I was like, yeah, sure, I'll think about it. But after thinking it over a bit and giving the game jam's front page a few reads, I started to toss around ideas. I was pretty freshly graduated and was struggling to find work, so I had a lot of free time on my hands, and the idea of a game jam with a cash prize was enticing. At the time, the game jam's theme hadn't been announced yet, but the jam was explicitly horror themed, which appealed to me. Right away, I knew I did not want to make another FNAF-style sit and survive. I had been doing those for about a decade now, and was pretty much over it. But my development skill set was limited, and I knew I couldn't learn a 3D engine in time to make an entry. So I wondered, how can you make an interesting 2D horror game that's not first person or a visual novel? After doing a bit of research online, seeing what other kinds of 2D horror games other people had made, the only option that really appealed to me was to make some sort of side-scroller. But I didn't want to make a game where you just walk left and right a bunch, some spooky things happened at scripted points, and then the credits rolled. I needed real gameplay, and for a while I was stumped as to what that could be. The idea ended up hitting me when most of my good ideas do, which is when I'm in bed trying to sleep. What if, instead of protecting 191, you were 191, wandering around through dark laboratories with danger around every corner? It'd be some form of survival horror. The idea appealed to me for a number of reasons, but one of the things I was most curious about was what it would be like to play as someone like 191 in a survival horror scenario. This might just be my American blood talking, but whenever I'm playing as some able-bodied dude in a horror game, and I pick up a gun, a lot of that fear dissipates. All of those threats in the darkness don't matter anymore. I am the threat, as long as I have ammunition. I wondered if playing as someone like 191 would make you feel more helpless, even if you're armed. The next day, I got to work on elaborating on that idea. Now, I couldn't use 191 directly, since the game had to be an original IP for the jam, but I could definitely use her as a jumping-off point. And so, that afternoon, I made a sketch of the character that would eventually become Anna, simply called protag.png. Speaking of, I'm not really sure where the name Anna came from. Annabot was just sort of a working title that stuck because I couldn't think of anything better. It's just a mix of Annabelle and Robot, though I only ever call the protagonist Anna in-game. I guess Annabelle would be her full name, and Anna's just a shortened version, I don't know. Hi, me from the future here. I'm halfway through editing this video and I just realized where Anna's name comes from. In early 2025, I was trying to write an SCP of my own, and I named the entity Anna. This was supposed to be a pun of analog since the SCP was about analog media. This SCP I was writing has nothing to do with Annabot directly, but I'm pretty sure it's why the name Anna came to mind when I was thinking of female names. Alright, bye. Anyways, I had a core idea for a game I really liked. A survival horror, 2D side-scroller featuring a character similar to SCP-191. But I had gotten a bit ahead of myself, and came up with the idea before the theme of the game jam was even revealed. But that was fine, right? Surely the theme would be something I could work with, it was sit and survive. The theme was fucking sit and survive. I took the news well. The one type of game I absolutely did not want to make was the theme of the jam. It was so unbelievably over. But, thankfully, I'm very stubborn. I was too attached to the idea by this point to just give up on it. So, after letting the initial shock of the theme reveal wear off, I got back to thinking. What if the game was still a survival horror, but every level ended with a segment where you plugged yourself into a chair and were forced to do a brief sit and survive segment as you powered up an escape elevator? Initially, this segment was going to feel very tacked on, just as a way to get my initial idea to qualify for the jam. But over the course of development, the sit and survive sections became the game's focus, which I think was ultimately for the better. Partially because it made my game fit the jam better, but also because the sections ended up being way more interesting to me, personally. So, I dusted myself off, and got back to work. Anna's design was pretty much directly translated from the initial sketch, I just gave her worse posture when it came time to animate her. She definitely takes a lot of design influence from fan depictions of 191. The biggest single design cue is the face being split into distinct sections with a single red eye. Everything else just a collection of character design aspects that I like. I like it when female characters have long, messy hair, and her light hair color was chosen to make her stand out against the background, along with some color theory stuff that I'll talk about later. About a month after the game was submitted, I realized I might have accidentally stolen her hairstyle from another character that I like, but that character is super obscure, and the hairstyle was pretty abstracted by the game's art style, so it's probably fine. I also like when robot characters are broken down, have obvious asymmetrical features, and are maybe a bit disproportionate. This is definitely something that stems from my love of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and you can definitely see this same sort of asymmetry in what I did for Fazbear Entertainment Storage. Tattered clothes, especially longer garments, are another character design aspect I enjoy, which is why her clothes are vaguely dress-like. The little label on her chest is a small, dehumanizing element. I also wanted players to realize that this character was a cyborg and not a full robot, so I gave her a single human foot. The lighter section of her face is also supposed to be skin, but that ultimately wasn't very apparent. As for the game's art style, it was kind of created by accident. It spawned from an entirely different idea I had, which was to create an art style inspired by David Dees. Now, even if the name David Dees doesn't sound familiar, there's a good chance you've seen his work, or an edit of it. Dees was an artist who made Photoshop collages based on politics and conspiracies, and his art fascinates me in a way I can't quite describe. Nobody would look at one of his works and think it was a real image, but they're far from low-effort kit bashes. There's a very clear effort to make the source images look cohesive and to guide the eye in what are usually incredibly busy compositions. It toes a line between cohesive and incomprehensible that intrigues me, for better or worse. This gave me my initial idea for the art style, where every character and object was made up of multiple images assembled into something cohesive. My first idea was to make each image look like it was cut out of a magazine of some sort. Each character and object would be made of a series of images with a crumpled paper texture, assembled into whatever they were meant to represent. So I opened up Blender, and spent a bit making a crumpled paper shader to use as a base. But after finishing my initial test, I realized that solid colors looked pretty good on their own, and it saved me the trouble of needing to find free-use images for everything. And thus, the core of the game's art style was born. I made the first sketch of Anna about an hour after I made the first version of the paper shader. What made the art style so good for a game jam entry was that it was something I could work incredibly quickly with. Every image in the game was an assembly of flat planes in front of an orthographic camera. I only had to worry about how things looked from a single perspective, and creating graphics was just a matter of outlining a shape and vertices and applying the shader and materials. It helps that I enjoy angular character designs, which were very easy to make given the style. I'm not quite sure where the grayscale and red color palette came from. A lot of people have made comparisons to Madness Combat, but that's a series I'm only vaguely familiar with. Maybe I borrowed the colors subconsciously. I just knew that I needed the red for Anna's eye and for bloodstains. I did enjoy working with the limited colors I had. A small detail is that all of the game's enemies are unified by this drab, dark red colors in their accents. Except for these guys, I forgot to put it on them, just ignore it. I like little unifying design elements like that. This includes the game's final enemy, but I'll talk about that design process later. Anna being largely white in color helps her stand out, but it's also something I chose very intentionally because white is the color of innocence. It's pretty common for horror protagonists to be deeply troubled people who, to some degree, deserve to be in their current situation. I enjoy the idea of Anna being a blank slate, thrust into her current situation through no fault of her own. One playtester went as far as to refer to her as a pure soul after completing the game, despite how the game ends. To be honest, I was regularly questioning the choice of Anna as the game's protagonist and how I was presenting her. I know I wanted her to seem helpless and frail, but I also didn't want to beat the player over the head with it. There's a great video by Yahtzee Croshaw that talks about female protagonists in video games and how they're portrayed. Yes, I know, it's a video about gender in video games, but I promise it's worth your time. Anyways, the video talks about how AAA games especially will sometimes put so much emphasis on the suffering of a female protagonist that they almost seem to revel in it, like the desire to make the character someone to protect supersedes the fact that the protagonist is someone the player inhabits. But more interesting to me, the video talks about denying the protagonist's agency for the sake of kicking the crap out of her. It's contrived suffering, where the protagonist's choices aren't really a factor, and the protagonist continues to engage in the suffering for no real reason, other than a perceived need to. Now that really intrigued me. I knew going into the game that I was going to have Anna go through a fair bit of suffering, as any horror protagonist should, but there's nothing technically stopping her from just not listening to the unnamed voice telling her to do his bidding. I remember showing the game to my mom, and she asked me, why are we listening to this guy? The way I imagined it is that Anna hasn't been alive for very long. She wasn't born a cyborg baby and developed into a cyborg girl over time. How you see her in-game is how she was built. And if this voice belongs to the only person she's really known over the course of her short lifetime, and he asks her to do something, what reason would she have to do otherwise? What could she do otherwise? I definitely didn't want her suffering to be overemphasized though. The only time I linger on it with a lot of intention is in the final scene before the ending. Ultimately, I wanted Anna to be someone you root for more than someone you want to protect, and judging by how most people react to the ending, I hope I succeeded in that regard. Yeah! Sorry, I got way off topic there. Let's go back to actually developing the game. Graphics were created on an as-needed basis. I'd render sprites of Anna walking and implement her walking animation. I'd render out graphics for the shotgun and implement weapon switching. I'd render out a shooting animation and implement shooting. It was a nice back and forth that kept me from getting tired of doing either part for too long. The low frame rate of the game's animations was another huge advantage when it came to making graphics quickly. Animation took much less time because I only had a small handful of frames to worry about for each action. It probably helped save on file size too. Another thing I like is when cyborg characters do little things to hint at the fact that they're not just cold, calculating machines. So I tried to sneak some of that in when I was animating Anna. Little things like making her eye widen when she shoots the shotgun and having her wince when she takes damage. The game's sound design has been the source of a lot of compliments, which made me happy. I've been trying to take the sound design of my projects more seriously, and I'm really pleased with how it came together. The vast majority of the game's sounds were assembled using free use samples on Freesound. However, I did end up recording a few samples of my own, such as the sound for reloading Anna's gun. Speaking of, even in its very simplified design, her gun is very obviously based on the Spatus 12. It's my favorite video game gun of all time, probably largely due to Half-Life 2. It has such a distinctive silhouette that there was really no other choice in my eyes. The first week of development was spent creating basic stuff in a very empty room, walking, shooting, and things to shoot. It was a bit of a struggle at times, since I had never made a game like this before, but it was fun, in a strange way. The Walker was the first enemy I programmed. Everyone else was just sort of clutched together using it as a base. All the enemies have very unimaginative names that just describe what they do. Walker, Dropper, Sprinter, Shooter. I remember showing some friends of mine an early outline for the game, and upon seeing that there was an enemy called the Sprinter, my friend Urisil suggested that it should scuttle like a spider. Now, my original plan for the Sprinter was to have it run on two legs, like the Flukemon from Hollow Knight after they get cut in half, but I'm really glad I went with the spider idea. It made for some really fun sound design that freaked out a few playtesters. Speaking of the Sprinter, its roar uses a sample that I've been sitting on for a long time. I originally found it for an SCP Secret Laboratory pitch that never came to fruition, but I was very happy to reuse it here. I don't have too much to say on the creation of the other enemies. Like Anna, they were all pretty much directly translated from their initial sketches with minimal tweaks. This wasn't intentional, but I'm pretty sure I got the Walker's weird scythe hand from Deltarune chapter rewritten. This is a connection I only made afterwards, though. Once I had basic mechanics and a roster of enemies working, I moved on to creating the Sit and Survive gameplay, which was comparatively much simpler. I'm happy to say that, among all the ideas and influences that this game cobbles together, the idea of a 2D Sit and Survive based on positioning is an idea I think I can call my own. It just sort of stemmed naturally from taking the gameplay concepts I already had in mind and restricting player movement. It'd be boring if all you had to do was look left and right while shooting the occasional bad guy. The idea of using the recoil from a shotgun to push a swivel chair was something that felt intuitive to me. I always imagined all the classic FNAF games taking place in a swiveling office chair. The recoil-based movement is probably inspired by the M249 from Half-Life Opposing Force. My original plan for the game was to have 4 levels, the final one being the boss. The first level would have walkers and droppers, the second level would introduce the Sprinter, and the third level would introduce shooters. I eventually ended up mashing the first and second levels together for the sake of time, and because I was worried that dealing with walkers and droppers alone wouldn't be that interesting. The first Sit and Survive level was finished on the 12th. At this point, I was making the game completely on my own. This is just a personal choice, but when it comes to game projects, I try to be as self-sufficient as possible. It's not that I necessarily want to do everything myself. On paper, splitting up the workload means more work can get done, but I like being independent, or perhaps more accurately, I don't like relying on other people. I enjoy making a game's visuals, I'm content to take care of its sound design, and I'll begrudgingly put up with programming, but I can only wear so many hats at once. One area I have absolutely no experience in is music. I've got a pirated copy of FL Studio that I don't know how to use, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, so I think I got the transcription right. So that should sound like that. Let's
So after completing the first Sit and Survive level, I realized I probably needed someone to make music for the game. The first person I reached out to was Super SMZ, who I had worked with in the past. He's an incredibly talented guy, and made the music for Fazbear Entertainment Storage. But he seemed busy at the time, and I was a bit worried about the quickly approaching deadline. So I sent a message in Catcore's Discord server saying I was looking for a composer, and Mango Square reached out. He was already making music for a different game jam entry, and I was happy to have him on board. But then Super got back to me and said he was available, and I was like, damn, what now? What ended up happening was that I split the workload between the two of them. Square handled the more ambient tracks while Super made the Sit and Survive ones. This ended up working out very nicely, and in my opinion, played to each composer's strengths. Each of them ultimately contributed 2 songs to the final entry. I had a pretty clear vision for the game's ambient tracks, which was inspired by the OST of Psychopomp. But I didn't really know what I wanted for the main Sit and Survive theme, so my instructions were more vague. I pretty much told Super to just wing it, and he got to work on the theme that would eventually become Jumpstart. At this point, I was halfway through the jam. The music was being made, and the first 2 Sit and Survive levels were complete, which meant I got to start work on the final level, which is something I was really looking forward to. If you haven't played the game yet, this is the last warning I'm going to give, since I'm about to spoil the game's finale. If anything I've talked about so far sounds interesting to you, the link is in the description. Alright, welcome back. At the very start of the game's development, long before I had any of the details figured out, I knew how I wanted it to end. Everything before the ending was effectively just set up. When I was gathering my thoughts for this dev commentary, I was able to name the inspirations for most parts of the game pretty easily, or at least remember my thought process leading up to an idea. But I don't know where the idea of V1 first came from. I just knew that I wanted the game to end with a climactic final fight, and since you're playing as a robot, fighting an older version of yourself was the first thing that came to mind. One of the first things I did for the game was write out all its dialogue. The first draft was finished pretty quickly, but I really agonized over the details. I'd open up the Google Doc first thing every morning and change a word or two before continuing other aspects of development. I like it when blocks of dialogue or full stories take on a new meaning on a second read or playthrough. All of the game's tapes are talking about V1 instead of the Anna you play as, and while the player has no way of knowing who V1 is in advance, I try to leave a lot of hints that something wasn't quite lining up. You're told the shotgun might not fit you, but the shotgun's tape said that you already had it at some point in the past. Another tape mentions that your voice crackles, but you don't speak. I love little details like that. Plus, the startup screen for the second level outright calls you V2 briefly. I swear I've seen this sort of twist before, where you think a game is talking about a certain character, but in reality it's talking about someone else. I just can't seem to figure out where I've seen it. Whenever I bring it up to friends, they can name examples, but it's always stuff I haven't watched or played because I live under a rock. Even if I don't know the catalyst of V1's creation, I can name inspirations. Her fight is largely inspired by Am from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And before all you fake fans show up thinking you know a damn thing because you saw The Amazing Digital Circus or watched a TikTok using a clip from an audio adaptation, go read the original short story. It's 11 frickin' pages. You know that quote everyone likes to rip off of? The whole million miles of printed circuits bit? That's not even in the original story, it's from later adaptations. If you would please consult the graphs. Sorry, where was I? Right, V1. When I first read I Have No Mouth, I was really captivated by the idea of living at the core of this gigantic machine that you can't quite grasp the full scale of. This ended up being combined with V1's other main inspiration, which is Mangle from Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Mangle had always been my favorite design in the series by a wide margin. I love her to bits, no pun intended. So if I was making a game with broken robots, I had to do something inspired by her. She's the reason V1 attacks you with a bunch of different arms. This is a small detail, but V1 having a voice that crackles is directly inspired by a line in Special Assets, the tail with SCP-191 that I mentioned earlier.
Pretty colors,
She said, in a voice that buzzed and crackled like an old AM radio. The buzzer sound that plays when some of V1's arms descend is samples from the infamous buzzer radio station. V1 was, fittingly, created in pieces. I make one aspect of her fight at a time before ultimately stitching them all together in what became the final level. I'm really happy with how it came out in the end. For a very long time, the song that played in V1's fight was Plug and Pray, a Deltarune fan song by Lunaxis. In particular, it was a remix of that song by Fabiculus. I listened to that song a ton while developing the game, and replacing it with the real song was one of the last things I did before release. I guess that means V1 had the freedom motif for a while. Honestly, I wish I had a bit more time to work on V1's presentation outside of the fight. The reason only her eye is visible before the fight starts is because I genuinely didn't know what her face would look like when I was working on this scene. Her core is the last character design I did for the game, and all the work surrounding it was a bit hasty since the deadline was starting to get close and I was starting to burn out. I don't have that much to say on the game's ending, but I will say that watching it come together after having it in mind since development began was incredibly satisfying. I really poured myself into the creation of this game. I would get up every morning, go straight to my computer, work until I was out of energy, go to bed, and spend an hour thinking about what I needed to get done tomorrow before falling asleep. It was a real grind where I gave myself very few breaks because I wanted the game to be as good as it could be in the time that I had. When I finally reached my wit's end and was completely burnt out, I wrapped the game up and sent it away to the Game Jam submission page. It was submitted on October 26th. It was entry number 21. Ultimately, though it's rough around the edges in places, I'm happy with what I was able to put together. The wait for Phisnom to finally play the game was agonizing. My confidence in the game constantly wavered between I'm gonna win and everything's going to go wrong every 5 minutes or so. When the stream finally happened, I was in a half-asleep delirium since I was recovering from surgery at the time and wasn't quite over all the drugs. I tuned in just as he beat the second level. The response the game got from him in chat was overwhelmingly positive. Everyone was just so nice. There was a smile stuck on my face the whole time I was watching. As the stream went on, I kept pacing around the room trying to calm down. And when he beat the last level and cheered at the ending, man, I hadn't been that happy in a long time. I've watched that portion of the stream countless times. Ultimately, I'm very happy with my second place position. For my first time entering a game jam, it was a very rewarding experience. And to Phisnom's credit, I probably would have never made something like this without the pressure of a deadline and the allure of a cash prize. It's so nice to have a game and characters that I can call my own, even if they're inspired by a long list of sources. This is also my first time using Game Maker Studio 2. I'd always used the old version because I'm stubborn and don't like changing my habits. Also, the game got fan art, which blew my mind. If anyone else ends up making fan art of the game, please send it to me. I'd love to see it. So, what now? Well, I'm currently working on a more polished version of the game, with the goal of putting it up on Steam. The plan is to have new levels, quality of life features, and a lot more general polish. If you'd like to follow the development of this version, I'll be posting devlogs on this channel, so subscribe if that's something you want to see. I've also got an old Twitter account I'm planning to start using again, so I'll link that in the description. In the meantime, go support the game's composers. Super's got uploads of the game's Sit and Survive tracks up now on YouTube and streaming if you're interested. I'd also like to take a second to thank the friends and family who supported the game's creation and gave feedback. The support really does mean the world to me. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. And if by chance any SCP authors are watching this video, go write something with 191. And make it a happy story, please.